week starts off with some sad news. The Latin language died in the year 700. No funeral was held, which is a good thing because somehow, someway, Latin continues to weave and wind its way into our society. The words on all our old buildings, for example, are in Latin. The motto of our school and of our country is in Latin. Numbers of the Super Bowl, those are all Latin. But the weirdest place that I've seen Latin show up today is in video games. But not just anywhere, I mean in the music that goes into these games. As someone who studied the Latin language and translated Carmina Burana, I thought it was exceptionally interesting to see the same text show up in a video game where you hunt down a crazed warlord in a sci-fi fantasy dystopia. I also thought it was interesting, as someone who has translated Ovid, to see the same text show up in a game where you play as a little purple dragon that fights evil. As someone who studied Latin for a long time and usually thought of it as a dead language written by primarily dead people, I also thought it was interesting to see modern authors creating their own Latin lyrics to go into these games, specifically this one from World of Warcraft. As you can read, it makes no sense in translation, but the fact that these authors are using this language and trying to make it a tool instead of something that we reference, I think is very important. These are all three different games, three very different contexts, but the same language. So in order to try to understand why this was such a phenomenon, especially in this space, I studied it for about the past year and a half. I collected a list of 137 tracks from over 50 different games, which all contain Latin. They come from 9 different countries, all published within the past 30 years, which incidentally is about the same time when technology was able to incorporate lyrics into video games. And I did this to try to understand Latin's place in society and what classics is doing in the world we live in today. Some things we should know about as we go into music in the video game space is that production has changed a lot over time. It has gone from being very small studios, kind of in a basement somewhere, making big arcade machine games, to massive $100 million projects with hundreds of people working on them, multiple years, and selling for very big prices. So that means that music has become much more of a thing in video games as games kind of go from being entertainment to entertainment and art. I will also say that music comes very late in the production process, kind of after all the gameplay has been decided and all the stories have been really set in stone. While this may make the music look like more of an afterthought, the ideas that go into the music have been brewing for a very long time, and a lot of people have been putting their input into them. One other thing to note is that because video games are commodities, they are subject to international trade and then subject to censorship, especially across country lines. This is especially interesting considering that most video games are made in Asia or in America and kind of cross those boundaries frequently. And I think it's important to note that even though there is censorship issues, that Latin continues to kind of pave right over these things and that it kind of has transcended its traditional locational boundaries. So for my next For my next trick, I will go through about 2 years worth of data in 9 questions and hopefully less than 10 minutes. So I said that there were a lot of tracks from all these different games and places, but is there really only one kind of company that is making them? Is there only one company that produces them and brings them to market? Are there only one type of composer that really makes them? Is it not really a big movement? Is it just only a few people? And it really is not exceptional to any one person or any one company. There are a lot of developers, publishers, and composers who are all working in these mediums. Most of the sprites that you can see on these graphs come specifically from outlier games, where it's one game that has a lot of tracks or one series that has a lot of different games. A lot of people are using them in a lot of different places. And if they're using them in so many different places, where geographically are they coming from? Is it one type of country, one type of region? And it's really mostly coming from Japan and America, with more of a skew towards Japan. This is kind of against market trends, where China is usually the biggest producer of games, followed by America and Japan. And I think this really emphasizes that this is a choice that these games are making. That this is definitely not just following market trends. I do think it's interesting that Japan kind of edges out America with these songs, especially since Japan doesn't have as strong of a classical origin as America does. So if we know that it's coming from those different countries and all those people, where do we generally find it? Do we find it on our computers? Do we find them on arcade machines and consoles? Do we find them on our phones or on our laptops? And we usually find them on the Windows system. My computer is a Windows, I'm sure this computer is a Windows. It's a very accessible medium, has a lot of different uses, can do a lot of different things, from opening Word documents to running big, big games. You can also take it anywhere and find it anywhere. I would say it's a very cosmopolitan medium. So I think it's important to note that Latin is found in a lot of different places and can be accessed from a lot of places. Kind of against where we normally find it in history, just being for the church and for the Romans. So if it comes from all these places, and it's around all over the place, and it's going everywhere, does it play well with other languages, especially those that we have today? Does it work with the modern languages around, or is it just kind of itself? And it is overwhelmingly only for itself. A whopping 90% of all 137 tracks only contain Latin. This is rather understandable. For example, if I'm an English author writing a song in English, probably will only use the English language. However, I do want to note that these authors who write this music aren't just sprinkling random Latin phrases into their songs that are in their own languages. They specifically want to use this language in particular. I think it kind of emphasizes the otherness that this language has, especially in the modern sphere, and that when people that use Latin, they really want to use Latin. So if people are using all of this Latin and only Latin, are they using it from sources? Does it come from something that a Roman person wrote? Does it come from Catholic liturgy? Or is it mostly written by modern authors? And my data says that it's mostly written by modern authors. A little over half of all the tracks that I have no source. They are written by their authors today for these places specifically. And I find that super exciting. It kind of indicates that Latin is kind of still being used and still being worked with, even though it's a very old language from a long time ago. I will say some of the pieces that we see most often being quoted are the Commedia Verona, Dies Irae, and August Dei, which are some of the most popular pieces out there too. So I'm excited that Latin is still so popular today. So if we find it all these places and we know what it's doing, where do we find it in the game itself? Do we find them in like big scenarios? Do we find them kind of tucked away somewhere? And we typically find them in the background. A little over half of all themes are background themes. That's kind of music that you hear while you're navigating an area, solving a puzzle, maybe making a character, kind of underneath your normal gameplay. We also hear them in boss fights, when you're fighting a super powerful enemy, usually a big plot point, that's where we hear it. We also hear it in final boss fights, which is like the big centerpiece and the ending of the whole game, the big enemy. I would like to note that in these areas, these are all places of strenuous gameplay. These are places where you're not really listening to the music, you're navigating an area, you're fighting a boss, or you're solving a puzzle. They're not places where you would normally think to find this rather complex, grammatically inclined language, but that is where we typically find it. So if we find it, in these places, what kind of themes are the songs that we are hearing convey? Do they are like religious themes? Do they imply some kind of serious or epic scenario? Or are they more historical, like a historical montage? Well, all four of those categories are definitely true. Religious and historic are related to Latin's place with the Catholic Church and with the Romans respectively, whereas serious kind of implies like a grave and a dangerous area, and epic sort of implies grandeur and sort of funness. These four categories all pair off very nicely into two little sections. Religious and historic are directly related to Latin's history as a language and what it did, the people who used it, what they did. Whereas epic and serious are more the implications that we get out of that. We get like the gravity and the ritual of the Catholic Church kind of giving a serious attitude. And we also feel like the grandeur and the power of the Roman army when we think of epic. So while Latin can do a few different things with it contextually, it all is related to Latin's place in society and what it has historically done. So if we know what Latin is doing, what kind of sounds do we hear when we hear this music? Are we listening to modern music? Are we listening to older music? overwhelmingly, we listen to older music when we hear Latin. It's like 75% are operatic music, which is like the loud singing and the violins and the full orchestra. That's typically operatic. The only other section of note is Gregorian chanting, which is understandable. That's what we know of Latin music from the Catholic Church. I do think it's interesting that operatic there's just so much of it, because it sort of gives Latin an idea of dramatism and of theater and of gravity, and also of age. So I do think it is interesting that when these authors use Latin, they kind of match the style to the language to sort of bring back and forth the idea of age and antiquity. And for my last question, I noted that these tracks came out over the past 30 years, so I wanted to make sure that the way that we use Latin in video games hasn't been changing too much over the last 30 years, or if there were trends, I wanted to know those. And there are not really that many trends, to be honest. Most of the spikes that we can see in all these graphs relate to individual games and are rather outliers. Only one category shows any sign that it's been affected by time, and that's historic, where we had a very big spike and then it kind of fell off. That spike was, of course, related to one game, so that's also rather an outlier. But the way that video games have been using Latin over the years has generally stayed the same. So I do think it is important to note that Latin kind of entered the video game space with a very specific way that it was used and how the people who were using it were going to be using it. So what are some conclusions we can draw off of this? Well, we know that we find Latin in video game lyrics in Japan and America, and we can find it on a very accessible medium. When we do find it, it is often made specifically used and kind of like pointedly directed because of its cultural weight and because of its historic value. We also know that we typically find it in the background of gameplay, kind of under big moments in the story and in the plot, which we can imply to mean that Latin is a very thematic choice. These authors want to use this language because of the implications that we have of it, and that implication comes from its history. We also understand that audiences can understand this implicitly. We hear it during strenuous gameplay, but authors put it there because they know that it will still give out its meaning, even if we can barely hear the words. And that brings me to where Latin and classics stand in society. Latin has cultural weight. We can understand that from this space. And we know that its weight comes from its history with the Romans and with Christianity. Latin isn't really being used as a language anymore. It's more being used as a tool which we can use to encode certain ideas and themes into artwork. I would say that classics is not really dead at all, even though the language of it is. It's still very much being used because of the ideas that it can give out. And I feel like that's where classics is really standing today. It's not necessarily a study or a formal study or a language. It's more like a tool that we can all use, and I would say that we should use that. So even though Latin language died many years ago, and no funeral was held, which is very sad, it is no longer dead, and it will continue to be very much alive as time goes on. I would like to thank my advisor, Professor DiCenzo, my readers, Professor Joseph, my advisor, Professor Machado, my readers, Professor DiCenzo and Professor Joseph, the Holy Cross AV team for helping me put together this presentation and get the videos working, and my friends, family, and Holy Cross Honor Society for making this all possible. Thank you very much. And I am now open to your questions.
So I was interested by how you showed that Latin is more common in games from the United States and Japan.
Yes.
Maybe that has something to do with more games being produced in those countries, but I thought it was really interesting that in Europe they don't use it as much in like the former Roman Empire. Do you think that might have to do with, say, more familiarity with Latin in Europe? Do you think it loses its sort of exotic quality in Europe?
Yeah, no, that is definitely a good question, because we do see a lot coming from America, and America also has a romance history to it. It definitely is a thing for more research, especially with my considering that China is kind of the biggest producer, but produces so little Latin, whereas other countries do so much more. We do see it in Europe, but not as many places. But I definitely think that looking deeper at the way that these cultures treat their Romance origins or treat Romance origins from abroad is definitely another point of research for hopefully me in the future. Yes, please.
I thought it was a fascinating presentation. As somebody that was around when lyrics came into video games and it basically was playing it all the way through, I've been kind of curious about this. So One, Xbox One X. Are you counting the games multiple times if they're released either on multiple systems or with backwards compatibility?
Yes, so in general, each of these games comes out on an average of 3 different systems, up to like 20 or something. There's a few, but I definitely do count them, multiple ones in each category. But I do think it's important to note that even though these games might come out in a different console, but that they are adapted to Windows into something that is very portable and that you can find and kind of take anywhere. That would be my response.
And then the second question is, it's sort of playing off of the one that was just asked. It might be helpful to be able to look at the percentage of games that are coming out using Latin as opposed to just the count of them, and that would help normalize a little bit between like the actual number of games that are being published in each country. But also, did you find a difference between like mobile games versus console games? Like, was that any?
Yeah, not many mobile games. So it was kind of a little on the periphery just because there were so few of them to count. But I do also agree about the percentages. There are just so many games coming out every year. It was a bit of a tall order. But yeah, no, I agree. It was kind of a sort of a squeeze on the end. Yeah.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for that. That was great. And just one kind of fun question. To what extent do you think, seeing the popularity of some of the games, like you brought up Final Fantasy, you brought up Civilization, right? These are like super popular games. But do you think there's an intersection between Latin and what we might call nerd gamer culture that leads to its continued use and propagation?
Yes, that is a very good question. And I do think that there is, definitely between it being an older language or something that people can feel very good about saying, oh, that's Latin, I like that, or that it's Latin-esque. I do think that it definitely taps into that society of what I would say are like cognoscenti, people who are aware and who are very in tune with these trends. And as I said, production keeps going up and we keep getting more games, and games are kind of coming out of just entertainment and turning into art and entertainment, or maybe just art. And so I feel like these ideas of like where Latin language is going, what audiences is beginning to pander to, will just keep evolving as time goes on.
Excuse me, first I want to echo what's been said about those very implementation. And I guess also a little more question. Where was the most unexpected place you found a Latin attracting to Latin?
I will say one of the most interesting tracks that I ever heard was from it was from Portal 2, which there's like a computer that begins singing a song that's composed of Latin, Italian, and gibberish at the same time. And it's called Potatoes Lacrimosa because the computer is singing to a potato that is being eaten by a crow. And that are gibberish, Italian, and Latin. It's a very bizarre song, but it's very fun. But I think it kind of gets to the point that people are kind of experimenting with where we can find Latin. We don't just find it in this kind of a university. We don't just find it in the classroom. Find it when we talk about potatoes getting eaten by crows.